But if we think of that as being the only thing that it is, then at the point at which we say, but Cross has done atonement now, great, don't have to do Leviticus, didn't like it anyway, so that can just go away. And that's, I think, quite common. And I've never found that a very satisfying sort of thing to do with a text like that. And so I've wanted to spend time thinking through not just how is Israel worshipping, given that we do get a lot of detail about how they're worshipping, but also why are they worshipping like that? What's the ethos that's underpinning it? What are the priorities? What's the effect of it?
Welcome to TheoDisc. I'm your host, Kenny Innes, and this is the podcast of WTC, a theological college where rigorous study and the life of the Spirit are held together with the expectation that God will form us as we engage theologically. And today we're looking at Old Testament foundations for worship with Dr. Freddy Hedley. Often when we look at worship in the Old Testament, it can seem highly ritual, centered on external actions, and focused on the inaccessibility of a holy God. There's also a lot of blood, which can be difficult to stomach. But Freddy contends that the foundation of worship in the Hebrew Scriptures is heart posture, shared presence, and engaging in relationship with God. And we're going to unpack that today and how it might help us think through our contemporary worship context. Freddy is Dean of Studies at WTC and teaches biblical studies with a specific focus on the Old Testament and biblical Hebrew. He holds a BA in History and English Literature, an MA in Kingdom Theology, and a PhD in Hebrew Bible at King's College London. His research interests include Hebrew poetry, especially Lament poetry, exilic biblical literature, and the theological traditions of creation and covenant. Freddy is also the author of The God of Page 1 and the Colossian Image. Now, this is a bumper episode, so settle in and enjoy this exploration of Old Testament worship with Dr. Freddy Hedley. Well, Freddy Hedley, it's wonderful to have you back as a returning guest to TheoDisc. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you. Wonderful to be back.
And this is actually our first time that we're doing a kind of a proper video podcast, so bear with us as we work through all of this, but it's good to actually have your face for the viewers to see you.
Well, I'm glad you think so.
So we are going to actually be talking through some ways of exploring worship in the Old Testament in this podcast episode. Generally, when people come on to TheoDisc, I have to ask them 3 questions at the beginning about things that they return to, but you've already had that. If listeners have not searched the archives of TheoDisc, then go back all the way to, I think, episode 3 when Freddy first made an appearance in that episode, and we were talking about his doctrinal work in Lamentations. So actually, we don't need to ask you those 3 questions, but I thought it would be good to just find out what it is that you're listening to at the moment. What music is going around your head?
Well, so the music I tend to listen to is it tends to be kind of secular indie music is what kind of occupies my stereo. So on the way home from work yesterday, I was listening to Talk Talk's album Spirit of Eden, which I haven't listened to for ages and ages, and I was scrolling through and I'm going through the S's in my list and so close to putting on Supergrass, and then saw this and thought, no, that would be great. And I love the way that just builds a world, a kind of sonic soundscape world for you to inhabit, and it doesn't feel the need to rush its movement, and I really like that. But I went into work listening to PJ Harvey. I was playing Alanis Morissette for my daughter the other day, and Kate Bush as well, so few different things.
Can't go wrong with any of those. Now, it's interesting that you mentioned Supergrass, because I actually was listening to them a couple of nights ago.
Oh, really?
That first record. Well, I think they've been in the news a little bit recently around some of the Oasis-y type stuff. So,
oh yeah, of course. Yeah.
Which I think you and I probably were at the right time in the 90s to catch all of that music. And it was a time when it's like everybody was listening to music, but everybody also wanted to be in a band. And actually, most people that could play guitar were half decently could be on the cusp of playing gigs and getting a record deal. You think of some of the bands that were around at that time, it didn't take very much. So was that true for you? Were you a budding musician at that age?
Oh, honestly, I thought I was going to be the next great star. So when I was sort of 16, 17, I was a musician in a band. I grew up in London, so we were gigging in places in London, mostly in the little pocket of North London that I lived in. So we were going around and playing pubs and little clubs and things, and it was great. And you were aware that there was this thing happening around you where just occasionally you'd be playing in a pub and you would know that, that's where Blur played last week, and then they got signed. We were in and around that little world. So you're sort of, it didn't matter whether you had any talent or not, you were in the right room. So that was really exciting. So yeah, I was all in on that, and you can see today just how thoroughly successful that was.
Well, similarly, I started as a drummer and then moved to guitar because I realized that nobody can see you when you're behind a drum kit. But for me, that kind of ended up being what I did in church. So I was part of the worship team and used those musical skills to play in a worship band, and then eventually became a worship leader. And actually, I became a worship pastor when I was out in the States. I don't know if you had a similar experience where the ability to play guitar was picked up on and became part of your church world.
Yeah, and it wasn't so much that it was picked up on. I mean, I became a Christian when I was 17, and I'd been going to youth groups before then, but I kind of made a commitment at 17. And at the time, being a musician is how I thought of myself. I mean, I was still at school, but I was not really focusing on school, not really doing anything on school outside of that. I would go out of school, go to the studio, go to rehearsal, and I was a gigging musician. That in my head, that's what I was. And so when I became a Christian, that was the natural thing to do. That was the natural place to go and redirect my energies, was to gather together with other Christian musicians and to do the things that I was used to doing, which was playing in a band. So that might be on a Sunday, but also we set up our own Christian band, and it was writing songs and all of that. And it was really exciting. It felt like, and it was the kind of era of, it was just clicking into the kind of era when Delirious emerged. And so you felt like you were a part of a Christian music scene that was doing something really interesting. So yeah, and then that led me into being a part of worship teams, and to begin with just sort of the guitar player on the edge, and then over the years a little bit more up at the front and singing and playing and so forth. And I did that for a few years, but actually it's been a long time since that was the world I was living in. But that's how it was for quite a while.
Yeah, there's a real surge of excitement at that time. I think it's kind of like there's kind of a coalescing of your interests with, actually, this could be part of our worship experience. We can bring this to God, and we can sing songs that are enjoyable and kind of tie in with some of the styles of music that were going around at the time. And I think probably for me, a lot of it was learning from example. I don't think there was a great kind of, this is now how you lead worship. It was looking at all this stuff that was happening around and thinking, we could probably do that. That song only has 4 chords, and we could sing that in our church, and we could do it quite well. And there was almost a kind of an osmosis of it, just kind of absorbing and developing this way of worshiping God together and leading others in worship. It's interesting. I don't think there was any kind of real liturgical planning or any kind of sense of there's kind of a way that you do this, other than that you kind of get 4 songs together, and instead of spreading them throughout the church service, you do them all at one time. And there was a real desire for intimacy with God and a close connection, a rediscovery of God's presence. And I think it's probably true to say that for you and I and others who were part of that generation, it really sparked a real desire for genuine worship, and to see that continuing in church.
Yeah, absolutely. It certainly was a big deal for me. I thought I felt quite lucky because when I was in my early 20s and I met Ali, who I'm now married to, and she had just moved to Sheffield, so I moved up to Sheffield, and we were a part of a church in Sheffield that was a big worship centre place, and they thought quite carefully, I think, about how they developed their times of worship. So they thought about the importance of recognizing God's character in worship, of recognizing God's actions in worship, and that leading us to a place of thinking about how that affects us. And so you had this kind of sense of a journey through worship times that I really valued, and I loved that it coincided with a time where the worship leaders who were writing were quite poetic writers some of the time. You know, some of Martin Smith's songs are really poetic, and I loved that that sort of connection that you had to. You felt like you were singing out a community of soul, and I loved that.
Yeah. It's interesting though that when we go to the New Testament, we don't find a lot of kind of modes of worship. We know people are worshiping. There's not a lot of detail about what that looks like, so not a whole lot of us to draw from there. But as an Old Testament scholar, I know recently you've been looking quite a bit at how worship looks like in the Old Testament, and I think we can kind of begin to talk about that today and what lessons we might be able to draw from those Old Testament experiences.
Yeah, and it's been a question for me, both as an Old Testament scholar and as a Christian worshipper, for a long time about the place of, you know, what do we learn from Scripture about how we worship? Not just that we should, but that what should underpin that. And I find so much insight in the Old Testament about that. And I mean, there is a sort of natural point of connection, right? That, you know, we think of worship in the church most immediately as how we sing, and not entirely. And for some church traditions, how we speak liturgy, how we organize our overall times of worship. But singing looms large. You find that obviously just as much in the Old Testament, Book of Psalms, biggest book in the Old Testament. And but before you have any of that, you have also got the importance of ritual, the importance of sacrifice that we can sometimes think of in terms of, well, that's about a sort of mechanism of the kingdom that deals with atonement, which of course it is, but that isn't the only thing that it is. But if we think of that as being the only thing that it is, then at the point at which we say, yeah, but cross has done atonement now, great, don't have to do Leviticus, didn't like it anyway, so that can just go away. And that's, I think, quite common, and I've never found that a very satisfying sort of thing to do with a text like that. And so I've wanted to spend time thinking through not just how is Israel worshipping, given that we do get a lot of detail about how they're worshipping, but also why are they worshipping like that? What's the ethos that's underpinning it? What are the priorities? What's the effect of it? And then that informs for me how I think I should approach worship now, whether that's sung, whether it's liturgical, whether it's how I live my life, and all the rest of it is thinking, can I join the dots between what was underpinning the worship in Israel and what's underpinning the worship now, and also what was underpinning the worship in the early church. So that's that's led me down a line of thinking for a little while.
It might be worth just briefly commenting on the fact that there seems to be a wide variety of words that are associated with worship in the Old Testament. Yeah,
and it's interesting. If you go and do just a word study on the word worship in an English translation, you'll obviously find it everywhere. It will be all over the place. But if you then go to an interlinear Bible, an online interlinear Bible, something like that, and look at, well, what's the word for worship? You find that word is covering a whole range of different terms, and often those terms, so sometimes they are exactly what we would expect them to be. So the word is just praise, and which is great, but sometimes the word is more specific. It's more to do with posture. It's bowing down, or it's hands lifted up, or it's instructive in terms of, it's not just praise, it's loud praise. It's kind of exultant rejoicing. But equally, there's the outcry of lament and anguish that's also within the language. But actually, the most common words that you find are are shachar, which is to bow down, and avad, which is actually more commonly translated as to serve. So these are the words that more often than not that we're reading when we read worship, that we're bowing down before the Lord and we are serving the Lord. And that speaks to a couple of dimensions that are really foundational. So one of them is to do with relative position. And so we bow down before the Lord because he is mighty and great and he is the king. So we bow down in allegiance to the king. We bow down in honor of the king. We bow down in recognition that we're not the king. So that's all sort of inherent to our worship, is understanding that kind of postural position. But also the sense of service, which feeds into that relationship with a king, also speaks to worship that goes beyond the boundaries of a moment. It goes beyond the boundaries of saying the right thing at the right time. It's more about a whole approach to life, and that we live a life of service, and that a life of service is a life of worship. So you have these sort of big, broad brushstrokes, but within that, sometimes worship is plucking the strings of a lyre. Sometimes it's beating a drum. Sometimes it's raising your hands, and sometimes it's ripping your clothes. But all of it is worship, and you have this overriding sense that worship is all-encompassing. It's a sensory experience. It's a physical experience. It might take any of your physical capacities might be occupied by worship. You might raise your arms, you might hold your arms still, you might stand up, you might bow down, you might cry out loudly, you might fall silent in a place of lament. And so this physicality, which is then mirrored in their life of sacrifice. So actually, when you then think that they're worshipping primarily through sacrifice and through offerings, that is a major part of Israel's worship experience, then you start looking for the language of that, and there are loads of different words. Sometimes it's very difficult to tell the difference between them, and yet you have this wide vocabulary as well of offerings and sacrifices, which just show you how expansive that world is as well. So there is this breadth to worship that is reduced by just calling it all worship,
right?
Because it's an expansive idea.
Yeah. So if the semantic range is that wide, it should give us a sense of, like you say, worship encompassing the whole of life. And the Old Testament doesn't take very long to get into this idea of worship, does it? It's like right there at the beginning.
No, and it raises a question. So you have the formational stories of creation, and then that resetting in Eden, and then this tragedy of Genesis 3 and the breakdown of all the relationships in creation between God and humans and the land, and you coming out of Genesis 3 into a hard world, and we're then taken into the story of Cain and Abel, and Cain and Abel is not an easy story to read. It seems to speak to us only about how much harder the world is yet going to get when we then bring violence into that world. And so you have that one story going on of violence and how that is going to continue the sort of track of the fall, if you like. But actually the frame of the story is an act of worship. So this whole event begins because of an act of worship. That is a harvest offering from both Cain and Abel. And it's fascinating to me that the first story that the Old Testament chooses to tell of humanity outside of the garden is a story about worship. And it's a story that goes wrong. And it's worship gone wrong, and the events unfold because of the problems in Cain's heart that directly connect with the worship that he brought. And so there's a lesson there. It's the first thing the Old Testament wants to talk to you about after you've met God, after you have confronted your own tendencies, is to think about, well, what does worship look like in this world? And I want you to learn from how it went so very wrong about some of the priorities that might have meant that went so very right.
Yeah. So Genesis 4 is where the Cain and Abel story takes place. I think it might be good if it's a short passage, so if we read it, and then we can kind of talk about some of the detail.
Yeah. Do you want to read, or shall I?
Sure, I'll read it, and you can tell us about it. I'm just get it here. Now, the man knew his wife Eve, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I've produced a man with the help of the Lord. Next she bore his brother Abel. Now Abel was a keeper of sheep, and Cain a tiller of the ground. In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground, and Abel for his part brought of the firstlings of his flock, their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard. So Cain was very angry, and his countenance fell. The Lord said to Cain, Why are you angry, and why has your countenance fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is lurking at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must master it.
Yeah. So here's our first act of worship. And so it coming first should tell us that worship matters. It's the first thing about our life that we're reading about. But then also, why this account of worship first? What is it that this account tells us that is so very important that it's the first thing you need to know about worship? It's the thing that should underpin everything you read about worship from this point on. And it's rooted in the problem that I'm sure all of us come to with this passage, which is, well, what on earth did Cain do wrong? There's the first thing we should notice, I think, to be fair to Cain, just for a moment, is that it did occur to him to worship. It was his natural instinct for both Cain and for Abel was to worship at the time of harvest, at the time at which they are looking at what God has given them through the year. Both of their instinct is to bring an offering of thankfulness and recognition that God has done this for them. And so we have an act of worship that's rooted in a very good response to God, and yet there's a problem, and God accepts Abel's offering and not Cain's, and it causes a tension for us as a reader, because you think, well, what did Cain do wrong? And it's a question that we've wrestled with, probably all of us have wrestled with loads of times, and there are, I don't know the answers that you've come across. I've come across two more than any other. And one is much more satisfying than the other, and I'm not wholly satisfied by either. But the answer that I'm really not satisfied by is that there's something more inherently valuable in the offering of an animal than the grain, that Abel brings something more substantial. And you don't see that argued too often, but I have seen that argument knocking around, and it has a fairly fundamental problem, I think, which is, as far as we're aware, Cain doesn't have any animals.
Right.
So he's a grain farmer. So it's the only thing that the passage tells us about who Cain is that he's a grain farmer. So what's he supposed to do? And actually, when we then map a text like this over Leviticus, we find that yes, there are animal offerings and they are valuable, but there are grain offerings and they are acceptable. So that doesn't really work. But it is an answer I've heard running around more commonly and more satisfying, I think, is the argument that there's a clue given in the text that in Abel's offering, that Abel gave of the first of his animals. And so you have this kind of rings an echo. When you know how the whole Old Testament unfolds, it rings an echo of later times where you're going to know the importance of your animal offerings being blameless, of being whole and good, and of the first of the flock and so forth. You're going to just know that language, and so you're going to recognize its use here. Yeah. And we might then notice the silence of the same kind of statement over Cain's offering. So we would expect, mapping it over Leviticus, we might expect the language of first fruits, and we don't have that mentioned. Now, there's nothing to indicate in the passage that isn't what he's done, but it doesn't use that language. And so Is there a clue there? And I think that's a fair read. I think it's certainly a very fair question of the text, is to the extent to which it's doing that on purpose. The danger of it is that it's reading between the lines, and it is technically reading from silence, which is not inherently a bad thing to do. Inference is fine. Actually, biblical narrative is really happy with you interpreting through inference, but nevertheless, you're on slightly less solid ground when you're inferring your interpretation. rather than following where the story takes you. And actually, the story does take you somewhere. It does take you to a moment that that seems to be the hinge point. From God's point of view, is the hinge point. It's just not where we'd expect it to be, because it comes after the offering. And it comes at the point at which God has already responded. And so we want, in our kind of narrative head, to line these things up in an order that says, there's an offering, it's either good or bad, God responds accordingly, and then everything sort of makes sense. Whereas what we get is, there's an offering, no indication of good or bad, then God gives a response that doesn't make sense because we didn't see anything wrong with what came before, and then God exposes what was wrong. And the exposure of what was wrong comes in God's observing that Cain's face has fallen. And so actually that's where this passage points you to, as it knows it's raising the question, what did Cain do wrong? This is the only thing it's actually going to give you in terms of material to work with, in terms of what's out of place. And what seems to be out of place here is that Cain has an expectation about what should happen. He has a sort of a way of thinking that means that he thinks that there's a kind of equation in creation that if I offer the right thing, I will get a certain degree of favor in return. And that is a simple equation that you find all the way through world history, all the way across different religious tradition. We see it in the church today. Jesus wrestled with it when people were coming to him and saying, who sinned that this man was born blind? And Job is wrestling with it as he's kind of saying, I didn't do anything wrong, God's got this wrong, and everyone else saying, you must have done something wrong, look at how awful your life is. And God has to sort of come along and say, that's actually not how creation works. Creation doesn't stand or fall on your faithfulness, it stands or falls on my faithfulness. And I need you to see creation from my point of view for a moment, so that you can see that while your suffering matters and your suffering is real, and I want you to bring that to me, it isn't coming from a place of conditionality. It's not coming from a place of you owe me. It's coming from a place of open, genuine relationship and recognition of who God is. And in Cain, we seem not to have that. He seems to, his response to not being favoured is to be disappointed, which reveals that he was expecting something, which shows us that his worship when it was given was not given freely. It was, I'm sure, given genuinely, but it was not fully given from a heart of total open-handedness. So if it had been, when the offering wasn't favoured, his response would have been the same again. It would have not have been. So to be disappointed, it would have been to still recognise the greatness of God and the rightness of God, if you like. And so you have this this warning, if you like, about worship right at the beginning, which is it isn't actually, it's not rooted, worship, in the things that you're doing. It's rooted in the heart behind the things that you're doing, and the heart behind the things that you're doing must be pointed towards God and only towards God. Your worship should be for him and not for you. It's not about what you get back. It's only about what you're giving him. And this is the dimension that worship brings to that relationship. And it is a part of a relationship that is a communion between. But in this moment, your worship is freely given.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting to observe that so early in the Hebrew scriptures, because I guess it safeguards us from some of our more cursory glances at the Old Testament. We would say, oh, it's all ritualized, it's all external, thank goodness we now live in an age where it's all about the heart. Yeah. And actually, right from the beginning, this is the foundation of what we're bringing to God. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. And the consequences are terrible, but the promises are great, right? So when worship is healthy, it brings us into a richer relationship and encounter with the presence of God. And that is signaled in the Cain story, because ultimately this story leads towards a tragedy, and the tragedy is that Cain interprets God's words as punishments, to which God says no, and then he interprets his own actions as the only reasonable action left to him, despite God saying no to that, despite God offering protection for him. The only action he has left is to walk away from the Lord. And you have this sort of terrible final sentence of, and he walked away from the Lord into the land of Nod. And it's supposed to weigh you down with a sense of tragedy, that he was being invited into the presence of God. He was being invited to continue, even after he had killed Abel, he was being invited to continue his relationship with God, but he walked away. What's supposed to underpin healthy worship is bringing you closer.
Yeah. You've talked already a couple times about overlaying what happens in Leviticus over Genesis 4. Maybe we can look a little bit at some of the Levitical worship, particularly Leviticus chapter 1. But at this point, you further on in the story, you've got quite a developed idea of what happens during worship and what's supposed to, the structure, the liturgical elements of it. So what's happening there in Leviticus 1? We've got a lot more animals and blood and altars and all kind of things there.
Yeah, so things are more developed by this point. And again, we might just look at this and think this is about the things that are being done, because there's so much care and attention given to that. And in a sense, we ought to really notice that and value just how, it's so rare that Scripture gives you a sort of insight into the mechanics of the kingdom. Mm-hmm. It's not really the primary concern. The primary concern is that you know who God is, that you know who you are in light of him, and you learn to relate together well. That's the concern. And usually that means not knowing the mechanics. So asking questions about how things work behind the veil, or when things happened. Those kind of mechanical questions are obscure enough that we tend to end up in the church having arguments about what the Bible's saying about those things. Mm-hmm. And yet here is a moment where actually it will help you to understand worship better by seeing the mechanics of worship unfolding. So Leviticus talks us through different forms of offering, and it begins with a sort of generic offering that you might bring for any number of reasons, the offering of a bull, but it specifically talks about atonement. And so you see some of the mechanics of how atonement is working in this time. And so you're drawn into understanding some of the movements of worship, and you see the care and attention. It should raise that bar for us about just how much it matters. But it isn't only about sort of understanding that there's holiness on the line here, but there is also direction. There's a directionality to this worship, which is that it brings you to the presence of the Lord. And so there is the effect of worship that is in view just as much as the mechanism. And some of that is sort of obscured for us because we live in a very, very different world, right? So we would look at a sacrifice of a bull, most of us now, I think, with a certain degree of distaste, if not horror. And we'd be quite grateful that the cross means that we're not still doing that. And we happily can just put those passages away because thankfully no one's asking me where my knife is on a Sunday morning.
Yeah, it's hard enough cleaning up the chairs after a church service, never mind the blood and guts.
Yeah, but that clouds for us a little bit of a view of why those rituals exist. And that matters because it forms so much of the heart of our understanding of the cross that's to come as well. So we lose a connection with the sort of basic equation that blood is the source of life. This is so sort of key to the ancient way of thinking. Blood is the source of life. Sin is a source of death, and so we come to God as an unholy people approaching a holy God, and in order to bridge that gap, we need to find a way into holiness. And so our way into holiness needs to recognize that we need to go through a death and a resurrection. We need to somehow allow the sinful part, that is the death that we're carrying, fully die, so that we can come into the presence of the Lord as a rejuvenated, renewed new life. But that involves a kind of transaction of blood, because that's the source of life. So if you're carrying death, it needs to be covered by life. This is how the text is thinking. So So but you can't bring your own blood because it needs to cover all of your sin, and that would be all of your blood, and that would be that would not bring the achievement it wants. So you have this representational transference of the blood, that you lay your hand on this animal and it is accepted on your behalf. And so from that moment, the fate of the animal is your fate. And in the act of worship, that you're allowing that sinful side of yourself to die in order to be brought into a place of new life. And that new life is also through the blood. And the blood doesn't represent death here in this ritual. It represents the life that's coming. And the purification. The altar is purified with the blood. In covenant, the people are sprinkled with blood and purified with the blood. And so whilst that can be distasteful to us, actually theologically it's showing us something we might not otherwise see, that Israel would have experienced on a daily basis. But then we have again here a really sensory experience, and you can just imagine living around the camp of the tabernacle, where it's not just that those people over there are doing sacrifices and Joe Bloggs is off to give his sacrifice today and I wonder how that went. You are hearing the noises of the sacrifices everywhere in the camp. You're smelling the smells of the sacrifices everywhere in the camp. You would be permanently living in an awareness that worship was happening, that your every day was in the context of the culture of worship. It would cover you. So you have this this visceral experience of worship that is physical and occupies every waking breath that you have. And yet, what's fascinating about this text is, for all of that detail, the thing that it focuses most on, in the sense that it's the crescendo, it's the thing the text points to, is this sort of weird phrase that, and the smoke rises as an aroma pleasing to the Lord. And I remember when I was first reading Leviticus and trying to get my head around it and thinking through, well, why is this worship? In what way is this worship? And thinking that was such a very strange thing to focus on. It's a really, I mean, who cares what it smells like, right? But it's telling you something. It's reminding you that you're not the only one in this experience who knows what's happening. You're not the only one who's occupying this space, who's experiencing what you're experiencing. And you are hearing these sounds and seeing these sights and smelling these smells. The aroma arises through the smoke, and God is smelling that smell. And so once we've gotten our head over the kind of slightly odd theological detail that God is smelling stuff, that it brings us into this realization that actually the effect of this worship is to bring you and the Lord into the same space, that this God who you're used to thinking of as being either on the other side of the heavenly waters, or you're used to thinking of as on his throne behind a curtain in a room you can't access, that he's somehow away from you, that in the place of worship actually you're drawn into a place of fellowship with him. You're drawn into an altar table where you bring food, and that food is put on the altar table, and that food, which represents you but also represents the fellowship that you're enjoying with the Lord, rises as a pillar of smoke and fire. And you think, I've seen a pillar of smoke and fire before. It's the presence of the Lord. And so we are transformed in the sacrifice into the same substance through that representational handing on to the animal. We're transformed into the same substance around a table at which there is food. Some places in Leviticus describe the fire consuming the offering. We're literally eating the offering, achal. And so this sense that we come in worship to the presence of God, where you and he are experiencing the same thing in the same space at the same time for the same reason, in communion and fellowship around a meal table. And so that you really know that you're engaging in fellowship, that's the ethos, if you like, of worship that's underpinning it. And that is so valuable. And it involves such a transference from unholiness to holiness, uncleanness to cleanness, that the text wants you to really care about the detail, about how you get there, because it doesn't want you to make a misstep, because God wants you in this place, not standing on the outside.
Yeah, it puts me in mind of the the part in Exodus after the covenant's made, and you've got this kind of thunder and cloud and this terror of God on the mountain, and all of the blood of the covenant being made, and then at the end, God invites Moses and some of the elders up for a picnic on the hillside, and they eat with God. It's just remarkable. No one can see God and live, except here we are having a picnic with him on the side of this mountain. And of course,
but then think about that. No one can see the Lord and live. That's told to you so many times.
Yeah.
Now go and write a list of the number of people who see the presence of the Lord and live.
Right.
So what's that telling you? And yet at the same time, the language that often gets used in accordance with that is you need to really fear the Lord, and that language of fearing the Lord feels oppressive to us because we want to gather around the idea of love casting out all fear. So if God is the source of love, there can be no fear. When angels turn up, they say, do not fear. So why would you fear the Lord? But actually, when you look at the effect of fearing the Lord, which isn't a kind of nominal sense of it's just a big way of saying respect, it's fear the Lord, know the consequences of holiness, remember the stories of Uzziah and those who do actually die in the presence of the Lord. Really take that seriously, but note that when you do fear the Lord, the consequence of that is coming into his presence. Yeah. And that whenever that's spoken about, it's in the context of God making a way for you to come to him, not to hold you at bay. So, and it's the same thing with in the place of worship. We take seriously the intricacy of worship precisely because God wants you there and doesn't want you at a distance.
And of course, we have the most intimate moment between Jesus and his followers is around the table, and with the sense of this is the sacrifice of myself that I'm offering to you.
Yeah, and he quotes Exodus 24 when he does it. So he quotes the very scene you're talking about. Yeah,
right. Yeah. So in terms of our own practice of the Eucharist or communion in our church services, it would be interesting for us to reframe that slightly as the gathering with God around the table, that he is enjoying the meal with us at the same time. The last little thing I thought it'd be good for us to move on, we've talked about kind of Old Testament worship as kind of a posture of the heart, as this enjoyment of God's presence and intimacy with God, even through the steps that need to be made quite clearly and carefully. But the final thing I think it'd be good for us to talk about, which maybe we can connect to those first 2 points. This one is about lament, and we did touch on this in the last conversation we had. But it would be interesting to look at Psalm 88 and what it tells us about the posture of lament before God.
Yeah, so it kind of takes us away from, so we're sort of shifting gear from thinking about sacrificial worship and those kind of processes and into what we're more familiar with, which is sung worship. And yet there's an ethos of worship that is sometimes more evident in how we sing out of distress than how we sing out of praise in the Old Testament. And so we can learn about what underpins worship through all of Israel's sung tradition, and the praise psalms are wonderful, and we just know that they're our vocabulary for praise, and they are vocabulary. It's a vocabulary of worship for praise. We meditate on these psalms, and we sing them, and we learn them and recite them, and often many of us read them daily to sort of digest what that sort of depth of praise. But an awful lot of Israel's sung worship comes from a place of lament, and it raises an important question for us about, well, why is that worship? Because Psalms isn't being subtle about that. These laments are included in Israel's songbook, in Israel's worship book. They have one of Israel's festivals, and it bases its life on the kind of routines of festival. One of its festivals is gathering around the story of Lamentations and singing the Song of Lamentations in order to commemorate the loss of the temple. And that continues to be a really important festival in the Jewish calendar now. And so this sense that lament is as much worship as praise is really clear in the Old Testament, but it raises questions for us. It raises sort of uncomfortable questions about, well, why is that worship? Psalm 88, the reason we pick out Psalm 88 in a conversation like this is because it not only is it a very dark and difficult psalm, maybe the darkest of the lot, it is also one that it feels incomplete, because laments have a certain way of writing, and a certain way of being sung, and they have a direction to them. They start with a recognition of your position before God, exactly as we've seen in sacrifice, exactly as we've seen in Cain and Abel. You are God. There's a statement of faith, but then an outcry of pain and distress, and this is where I am. And very often that would be a physical as much as a spoken or cried out expression. You may accompany it with tearing your clothes and covering yourself with dust and scraping yourself with shards of clay to sort of mimic the experience of the grave, because you're saying that spiritually that's where I am right now. And so it sort of joins in with the idea of ritual, which is it's not symbolic, it's actually affecting something. It is making a fundamental difference to the relationship here. And so you have this outcry of lament, but usually laments lead to a remembrance of where God has been faithful in the past, and that brings them to a place of trust. And then laments usually finish with a line or two of praise. And so you have this sense in which laments generally they're resurrection songs. And so there's a pastoral edge to them. We can gather around laments in terms of how we navigate, and to think about how we navigate the journey from death to life in the day-to-day, in the things that we face as a community and as individuals. But Psalm 88 doesn't do that. Psalm 88 breaks that form before it reaches. It sort of reaches for some trust, but it doesn't believe it. The psalmist doesn't believe the statement. And it leads the psalmist to just go into an even deeper pit. And then it breaks off before you'd expect a turn to praise, with just this really broken sentence. It's hard to translate evenly, because it's a broken sentence that just says, my only friend, darkness. And it leaves you there, and you think, well, how's that worship? And you can feel the discomfort of the editor of the Book of Psalms, because their own discomfort is sort of evident in the fact that they put Psalm 89 right next to it, and which also has lament in it, but it begins from a higher place.
Right. And
so it brings you right back up and right into the center of God's promises, Psalm 89. So you have this kind of awareness that the editor was as uncomfortable as we might be, but it raises a real question for us about what is being gained here by saying not just that God is prepared for you to complain to him, but that when you sing these words, he's hearing worship. It's a challenge for us, and it's a challenge, as much a challenge for us in the church now as it ever was before. And it's perhaps the greatest and most obvious kind of separation that we have from the ethos of worship in the Old Testament to the ethos of worship that we carry now, because we still care about the presence of the Lord in our worship. We still care about putting God first in our worship, but how much do we care about giving license for lament, and not just saying it's okay for the one who's suffering to lament, but saying it's responsible for the community regularly, even when they are personally going through joyful times, to lament, because it gives permission and voice for the person who came in the room who is not ready to praise, who's not ready to sing songs of triumph and victory, not ready to say, I just put my hands in the air because you're so wonderful. Actually, it gives them a way of saying, God, right now, I'm absolutely furious with you. Right now, I blame you for the place where I am. That's all I've got, Lord. Yeah. That's all I've got to say to you. And God hears those words as words of prayer and words of worship. And it because it's worship, it then makes a way for that person to come into the presence of the Lord in a way that singing his praises that day might not have done.
Yeah. I was thinking about kind of what are some of the trends in worship songs that I hear a lot sung right now, and it feels like they lean more into kind of imprecatory psalms. So it's like, God's going to destroy my enemies and drown them in the sea and do all this. Not real people, but this kind of spiritual sense of I've got all this coming against me, and God's going to overthrow it. That's not the same as lament. And this idea of that maybe there's an expectation sometimes that by the end of a worship time in church, we might be able to pour out what's difficult, but there's a resolution. We'll walk away from that time with things may not have changed in my circumstances, but I've got this deep sense of peace that God's with me.
Yeah,
sometimes,
there's a sense to that. So there's you totally understand that instinct. There's a good reason for it. Mm-hmm. But the worry is that in doing so, you don't make space for a really substantial part of Israel's worship life that can make a huge transformational difference to the way that communities gather around times of difficulty and suffering. And we live in the luxury of you and I specifically live in the luxury of a Western world where sufferings can be sort of privatized and sort of held over there, rather than everyone's suffering affecting all of the community all of the time. And but when we gather around that idea that there are people who are not ready to say God's great, who are not ready to sort of stand in kind of spiritual opposition to the things that are coming at them, but actually they're just on the floor and they're just ready to say, I feel dead. That they need words of worship too, and lament gives us space for that.
It strikes me that in all these passages we've looked at, what we're really talking about is honest postures of the heart before God, however that looks in the physicality of offerings that are brought. And I think that's really interesting. Again, we talked about our perspective maybe on Old Testament worship, the way we look at it and disregard it. What would you say are maybe some of the ways that in our contemporary worship life, both as communities and personally, that we can reclaim some of that, those foundational things from the Old Testament?
The things I find myself thinking about, so this would be an incomplete answer because this is for us all to wrestle with. So, but the things that I find myself thinking about more than anything else are how much do I model and teach that worship is a whole life experience, that it isn't a nominal thing, but actually, we read the worship life of the Old Testament and they're living in a culture of worship the whole time. They're always smelling those smells, seeing those sights, hearing those sounds. But throughout the year, they're raising the cattle that they're going to offer at the end of the year. They're cultivating the crops that they're going to bring at the end of the year. Literally every act they perform through the year is an act of worship because it feeds into bringing you into the presence of God. How much do I really think about my life that way? That every act somehow should sow or cultivate or harvest something that brings me into the presence of the Lord. And how much is that happening from a posture of it's about what I can give to God rather than what might I get in return? And that is a difficult question for me to wrestle with, because I like going to churches that sing songs I like. And I like getting something out of worship. I liked, as a worship leader, this is a real wrestle. This is years ago now, but I would wrestle with, what if I don't do well? And I was really perhaps the most inspirational worship time I've ever been a part of was led by someone who wasn't very good. And wasn't confident, didn't really know what they were doing, didn't really know the songs that they were being asked to sing, but was prepared to stand up and do it anyway. And they knew it wasn't going to be very professional, and it wasn't. It wasn't that somehow everything came together and ta-da, it was all amazing. It wasn't. But the Spirit really descended on us, because we were gathering around the idea that there's a vulnerability and an honesty and an integrity to the worship that's being brought, and it was just incredibly powerful. And you were so aware that right from the worship leader right through everyone, we were worshipping because we cared about the Lord and not because we cared about looking good. And that's a subtlety, I think, that we need to wrestle with. And I do find myself worrying about the place of lament. I'm also comforted that I have conversations about lament a lot. So when we had our last conversation, we were talking about my thesis, my PhD thesis, which is on lamentation. So I've spent a lot of time with lament. So I have those conversations a lot, and I do find that over the last few years, the conversations I'm having are with people who are thinking the same things, and so I'm really comforted by that and encouraged. But I'm not sure we've figured out a way in the church of really making space for lament, really bracing ourselves for how uncomfortable that's going to feel. And it's not like we'll do it and we'll think, oh, well, that wasn't as bad as I thought. It'll be absolutely as bad as you think, and absolutely as uncomfortable as you think. But learning how to make space for that so that it becomes natural and becomes a way of the community gathering together is an ongoing challenge, I think, that I'm concerned with. And Walter Brueggemann talks about lament. We probably did talk about this last time, but Walter Brueggemann talks about lament in terms of its prophetic capacity as well, and its connection with our sense of justice and God's justice, and that if we lose lament, it's not only the worship that we're losing in the church. It's not only that dimension of worship. We're also losing a sense of urgency for the prophetic outcry for God's justice in the church and in the world. And are we prepared to let that go? And holding lament actually holds that closer to us. So those are the things that run through my head.
I think it'd be good for us to take away from this, those of us who are worshippers, to think about the scope of what we can bring to God. Those of us who are responsible for leading others in worship, to think about quite clearly not just borrowing expressions from others, but thinking about what we are leading our congregations into, to say before the Lord. And are there any areas that we feel uncomfortable with, even this conversation that we've spoken about right now? And maybe that might be the areas we want to push into slightly, that God is calling us to be honest with him. Go read Genesis 4 and Leviticus 1 and Psalm 88 and other places, and don't just discard the Old Testament when it comes to thinking about the life of the church in terms of worship. There's lots to be mined there, and really grateful, Freddie, for you just provoking some of that in us today, and hopefully we'll rediscover some of the riches that are there. But thank you for coming on. You can come back again, second time. Yeah, let's do it again.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, what am I watching next time? That can be our way in.
That's it.
I'd love to come back. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Freddie. Cheers.
Good to see you.